The United States has declared war on Germany, and now we're part of the biggest conflict the world had ever seen. What does that mean for us here in the United States? The war was something that was going on over in Europe. Well, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today we're going to take a look at what was going on the home front during the Great War. Specifically, we're going to try to answer the question, how did the war affect things at home in the United States? Pay attention to the video and be sure you get some great notes, and by the end, hopefully you'll have an answer to that question. Well, right from the get-go, the United States knew that its military wasn't quite up to the standard of European militaries. That's what the National Defense Act and the Naval Construction Act were all about, to kind of bolster up the militaries. But how did we actually get the number of troops we needed? Shortly after we joined the war, Congress passed what was called the Selective Service Act. Today we just refer to it as the draft. Essentially what this law does is it makes it a requirement that all men of fighting age, between 18 and I believe it was 35 at the time, had to register for a draft. And if your name got called, you had to serve a term in the military. During the Great War, 24 million men registered for this draft, and of those 24 million that registered, 2.8 actually got called up. Now that was people that got drafted. There are also millions of American men that willingly signed up to join the military. In total, by the time it was all said and done, about 4.8 million men served in the military during the Great War for the United States. Of those 4.8 million, almost 4 million actually went and served overseas. There was a lot of resistance to the draft, though. A lot of people considered it illegal. They said that the government couldn't force men to fight for the United States. In fact, about 12% of the people that got drafted never actually showed up for service. There's also a thing called a conscientious objector. A conscientious objector is a person who has some sort of moral or religious objection to fighting in war. Had some issue with the violence and killing people. In theory, a man could be exempt from combat service by claiming conscientious objector status. In theory. Unfortunately, most people who tried to claim this status wound up being rejected and have to go fight anyways. When the U.S. finally joined in the fight, people in government knew that we needed to really start cranking out war goods. Not to sell and make a profit from, but to be able to supply our own troops to ensure that we're going to win the war. Congress put a guy named Bernard Brunch in charge of a thing called the War Industries Board. His job was to go around to factories all over the United States and basically get them converted to making military products. Kind of as an incentive for factory owners to want to do this, the government said that, hey, if you produce X product for us, we will guarantee we will purchase every single thing that you make at this set price. And typically it was a pretty good price. A lot of factories and factory owners saw this as a way to continue to make lots of profit. They said, hey, now's our opportunity. If we expand operations, if we start making even more stuff that we're going to be guaranteed to sell, we can make a fortune. So you see the industry just ramp up just significantly, and the United States starts cranking out war products left and right. This industrial ramp up starts to cause a thing that's called the Great Migration. Roughly about 50,000 African Americans start moving from the south to northern industry cities for these war jobs that are starting to pop up. This actually had a negative effect as well, though. As more and more African Americans moved to northern cities, they started to see some hostility from the white populations. It turns out the North wasn't quite as idealistic of a place as most Southern African Americans thought it was. And you actually saw race riots and stuff like that happen in northern cities, which was kind of a new thing. When the United States officially entered the war, not every American was really on board with it. In fact, there was still a significant amount of the population that was still pretty isolationist and didn't want the United States to get involved. Congress created the Committee on Public Information as a way to try to sway public opinion about this war. They put a guy named George Creel in charge of this. Creel's job was to create stuff to educate the public on things that were happening in the war. Really what that meant was he was going to shape public opinion through propaganda. Propaganda is basically just information that's let out in a way that it kind of makes the viewer, the person getting that information, kind of believe what you want them to. The Committee on Public Information, they actually had all sorts of jobs when it came to educating the public. A few of their more famous slogans and posters are here. Have you ever seen this picture of Uncle Sam? The famous "I want you for the U.S. Army" poster? Committee on Public Education. They created this image to try to entice men to want to join up kind of on their own instead of having to wait to be drafted. Another really famous Committee on Public Information kind of slogan and poster was the "Destroy This Mad Brute" poster. Look at this poster and look how they've portrayed the Germans here. Other types of propaganda used were things like this picture right here, this poster right here. The "Don't let up, keep saving food." One thing that the Committee on Public Information did was they tried to get every American involved somehow. One thing that was really big was saving food. The more food that you saved, the more food that could be sent over to our soldiers. Our soldiers will be better fed and better equipped than the enemy, and will be able to win. This is a way of getting everyone involved in the war. Just like this Liberty Bond poster. It says, "If you can't invest, buy a Liberty Bond. Defend your country with your dollars." Again, there were people that couldn't necessarily go and fight, but they could purchase Liberty Bonds. Liberty Bonds were used as a way to help finance the war. As I mentioned before, there was a pretty good chunk of the population that really wasn't for this war. A lot of people were isolationist, wanted to just stay out of it. Because of this, there was a lot of dissent going around the country. People were saying a lot of negative things about the war and about Congress and about the people who wanted the war. To kind of get around this, Congress passed two pretty controversial bits of legislation. The first one was called the Espionage Act. Under the Espionage Act, there were really harsh penalties put in place for people that were spying, aiding the enemy, or interfering with recruitment of the military. Now, you may say to yourself, that makes perfectly good sense. During a war, you don't want people doing any of those things. But under the Espionage Act, they were incredibly loose on what the definition of spying was, or aiding the enemy, or interfering with recruitment. You could be considered aiding the enemy if, say, you were a grandma and your grandson was in Germany and you decided to send him some birthday cookies. Now, I seriously doubt that grandma wants to aid the Germans by sending cookies. She just wants to do a nice thing for her grandson. But that kind of act could get her thrown in jail for a very long time. You could also be considered interfering with recruitment if, say, you're a store owner and somebody plastered a recruitment poster up on your front window. Now, think about the time frame. Store windows were the main source of advertising for stores. If somebody plasters a recruitment poster on your window, you're not going to be able to do your advertising and you're going to lose money. But if you took that poster down, that was considered interfering with recruitment. You could be fined, you could be thrown in jail. The Espionage Act on the surface sounds good, but without some really tight control, it could get out of hand really quick. The other piece of legislation that was meant to crack down on dissent that was highly controversial was a thing called the Sedition Act. Under the Sedition Act, it made it a crime to say or write anything negative against the government or the war. Now think about that for a second. We have a thing in the United States called the First Amendment. Under the First Amendment, free speech is protected. You're allowed to pretty much say anything you want as long as it's not blatantly untrue or it's not blatantly meant to hurt somebody. But under the Sedition Act, if you said something as simple as, "Man, that government is just dumb for getting us in this war," that could get you landed in jail. Or if you said, "I just really don't like the fact that there are a lot of Americans over in Europe killing people," that could get you sent to jail. In fact, there's one anecdote where a politician said something negative about the war while he was campaigning for president and got thrown in jail. He kept campaigning and wound up getting 900,000 votes while he was in jail under the Sedition Act. People did try to fight this. It came up in the Supreme Court several times. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court sided with the government and kept upholding the Sedition Act. Okay, what do we need to take away from this video? Well, number one, the United States really needed to build up a better army before we could go fight in the war. Number two, it took some pretty serious educating to really get everyone on board for the war. And number three, there was some major crackdown on dissent here in the United States. There you go, guys, on the home front. What was happening in the United States during the Great War? Hopefully you got good notes. Be ready for that quiz in class. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, remember, until next time, don't stop learning.